Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I wish we could all be there together in person, but it's amazing what technology is letting us do in spite of all the pandemic problems. Um, I'm glad that you said that your introduction was kind of personal because this presentation is fairly personal. It's not a comprehensive encyclopedia of all the big storms in the history of what's now Washington State, but it's kind of a personal look back. It's also kind of a media history as well because some of the earliest history we have about storms in this area, it's not, of course, we don't have the native tradition from Native Americans. We don't really have much in terms of that. But in terms of recorded history, from the time since Europeans began arriving in the Northwest, the earliest memories are written. There's no photographs, of course. I don't even know of any sketches. And as we progress through this presentation, we'll see still photographs, we'll see vintage newsreel footage, we'll hear vintage radio recordings, and then ultimately even some vintage TV material as well. So it's kind of a storm history as well as a media history. And I've been really lucky in the kind of work that I've gotten to do over the last 25 years. I was at MOHI for about 7 years. I was the deputy director there back in the 90s and early 2000s. And I've been doing history on the radio and TV for the last 10 years or so. And so this love of storms, it's kind of a personal thing. I'm the youngest of 9 kids. I wasn't alive for the Columbus Day storm, but I grew up hearing all the stories about it from what my family experienced. And it kind of made me jealous. For instance, my mom, who's now deceased, she lived in London during the Blitz. She was just a little girl in the 1940s. And she used to tell stories about how she and her mother would prepare for each night's air raid drill by making tea and sandwiches and then going out in the little shelter that the government had built out in the backyard for families where she lived in London. And, they knew people who died in the Blitz. They saw lots of damage. But the fact they survived made those stories that she told about London during World War II kind of exciting to me. And she admitted it as a child living in poverty with her family. The war was sort of and she wasn't glib about it. She said the war was sort of a cheap form of entertainment for people in her economic class. And it was sort of, especially someone her age. And she didn't say that lightly. And so when I would hear stories about the Columbus Day storm, and we'll get into details about it later on in this chronological presentation, but my family's experience was that my mom was up at a grocery store up on Rose Hill, kind of between Kirkland and Redmond. It was a Friday evening, and around 7 o'clock or so, she had a couple of my older siblings with her. The storm came up so fast, knocked the power out while they were there at the grocery store. So and this was in the days before emergency generators and those sorts of things. She had to go around the store and try and track down a couple of my brothers and get them all hustled into the car. And in the time between when the storm had started and when they were heading back home, which was less than a mile, my mom had to reroute around several intersections and streets where trees had fallen down. It hit that quickly. And then back at the house where my father was with my other siblings, it was October, so it wasn't freezing cold, but it was chilly. So my father built a fire in the fireplace. They heated water on an old kettle, hanging it off the flue up in the chimney of this. Their house was built in 1959. It wasn't like it was some old farmhouse or something. But they were heating water over the fireplace. My dad would go out to the garage every hour to turn on the radio news on the station wagon to hear what was going on. And while the power was out for a couple of days, my mother had to cook for herself, my father, and my 8 siblings at that point, or excuse me, my 7 siblings at that point, on that one of those old Coleman 2-burner stoves. I know every family pretty much had one of those back in the 1950s and 1960s, those sort of suitcase-style metal Coleman stoves. So I would hear that story as a kid, and it made me jealous that I had missed it. I sort of thought, dang, I wanted to be there while the power was out and while we had to, eat off a camp stove and drink tea made over the living room fire. So that's why I was so thrilled when in 1990, we had a huge storm about a week before Christmas. It was December 18th, 1990 to be exact. I think it was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just moved back to Seattle. I'd been living on the East Coast. I was barely 20 years old. And I was staying with my parents over on Rose Hill in Kirkland, working in North Seattle, not far from Lake Union, the north end of the Lake Union. And the storm hit that day about 2 in the afternoon. And it started to fall and accumulate very quickly. I left where I was working to head home. And I didn't have a car at that point, so I had to ride home on a bus. And buses were barely making it up and down some of these very mild hills over in this part of North Seattle. Long story short, it took me about 8 hours to get home to Seattle. A ride that would normally take 45 minutes or so by bus took 8 hours. by bus, by hitchhiking, by walking the last mile or so. And I always remember, as I came to my parents' house, coming down the snowy street, and that, there's so much snow had fallen, something like 18 inches when it was all said and done, which is a lot for this area. As I'm sure most of you are familiar with the regular weather patterns around here. So walking up to my parents' house to the front door, and then seeing them as they opened the door, they were so happy to see me. They were worried about me, of course. I was happy to be home. And I think I was never happier to see them before or since that time. Of course, they're both now deceased. That's been, I think the 30th anniversary is coming up on this big storm. And I remember talking to my mom about this about 5 years later. And I said something like, that storm was so intense, and I've been waiting my whole life to have that kind of an experience of kind of survival and making it home, that I think there's sort of part of me that's always going to be out in that storm, trying to make my way home. And to my mom's credit, she was a very soulful woman. She said something like, and we'll always be here waiting for you. And I thought, that's perfect. She said the perfect thing. So the storms and big weather events, I think they're an opportunity for us to gather together as families, to help our neighbors, to experience things that we don't ordinarily think about in our day-to-day lives. And this presentation, I first put this together a couple of years ago, long before the pandemic. And during the summertime, when I didn't give this presentation at all, and when most of us were battened down at home, if we were lucky enough to be able to do that, I started to wonder if this thesis of storms being this opportunity to connect with each other and with our communities, with our families in ways we don't ordinarily get to do, I wondered if the pandemic would have sort of stomped out that thesis or made it irrelevant. And I don't think it did. I've given this talk now several times in the last month or so, and I think it stands up. I think storms are of such short duration, and they can be so exciting if not making light of property damage or people getting injured or getting killed, but storms can be this wonderful short-lived thing that we can't control, and that can be beautiful to watch and scary at times, but that ultimately give us this exciting experience to share and talk about later and kind of recall how we all came together. So basic premise, let's see here. Why am I not going here? Hang on a second. Okay, there we are. So extreme weather is very personal. My family did come here in 1959. That's the first house they rented over in Kirkland. That's the station wagon that my mother was driving home in that storm 58 years ago. And that's my older sister, my older brother there standing in the snow. This personal memory thing, I've given this talk now all around Washington State, and that's one of the wonderful things about Humanities Washington. They let people like me volunteer and dig into something that we're passionate about, and then share stories with people around the state. And then I meet people in person who come to these talks. Like a man in Aberdeen brought me this newspaper showing the big blizzard back in 1950. And he'd been saving it for years, and he folded it up and brought it out, came to the talk at the library in Aberdeen and unfolded it and showed it to me. He was so proud of having saved it. And that was just very cool. Sort of fit into that thesis of weather being this very personal thing that people remember. And I hope later in this talk, there'll be enough time at the end. I want to hear your memories of storms that you've survived, good and bad. I've heard some wonderful stories around the state about, dairy farmers having to rig their equipment up to run off the vacuum from the truck because with the electricity gone, they couldn't milk all the cows they had. And lots of stories about, and I don't want to be sexist, but it's usually men ignoring the forecast and then endangering their families by insisting on driving somewhere in the middle of a storm. So hopefully you'll have some memories like that to share as well. Let's see here. I'm not doing this. Okay. It's just clicking the mouse moves it forward. That's good to know. In addition to weather being sort of personal, I think there's sort of a cultural thing around weather in the United States, certainly. In my family, we grew up with this book, The Golden Guide to Weather, published back in the 1950s, along with all these other fabulous golden guides to rocks and minerals, or fishes, or Rocky Mountain National Park. It was a wonderful series with this beautiful hand, there's sort of watercolor illustrations that are hyper-realistic. And as a little kid, one of my older brothers had this book, and I coveted it, and he gave it to me when I was probably, I don't know, as a 15 or 16 years old. He gave me his copy of this book. And I've studied the cover of this book, just stared at it for years. It took me a long time to notice that up near where it says forecast there in the upper right, there's a little weather balloon right by the S. And the men on the hillside must have just recently launched that. But this book provided for me a survival mantra when I got caught in a huge thunderstorm in the Midwest about 30 years ago, and I was driving by myself across country. I was on Highway 94, I think in North Dakota, almost to Minnesota. Over to my left-hand side was a huge squall line. Looked like a flag, like a black stripe at the top and kind of a sky-colored stripe underneath. And it was off to my left, and I thought, I'm so glad that the highway is not headed that way. But of course, the highway curved around and pointed straight into it, and I drove through a terrible thunder and lightning storm for about 2 hours. It was only me and semi-trucks on the road. I would look over and see lightning striking lightning rods on top of silos and barns as I was driving past. And I had to be in Rhode Island. I didn't have time to stop. But fortunately, I'd read this book, I'd memorized this book, and a page of it gave me a mantra to repeat over and over again: car body shields occupants. I knew I was safe. I knew that lightning could strike my car and nothing would happen, so I was able to keep driving through the storm. And this golden guide to weather has sort of informed kind of a literary appreciation for storms and weather. And I'm not really I'm not a scientist at all. I'm not a meteorologist. I only sort of have just basic understanding of some of the science behind big storms. But what basic understanding I do have comes from the Golden Guide to Weather. So today, it's a fairly non-comprehensive look chronologically at big storms in what's now Washington State. My favorite stuff is wind and rain and snow. I'm not really big on floods, not big on tornadoes and those sorts of things. I like these kinds of wintry storms that might take the power out and give you a chance to hunker down for a few days. That's my favorite kind of weather. Of course, Lewis and Clark, not the first Europeans or European Americans to be in the Northwest, but the first who wrote about it and who came at a bad time of year. If you look at what Vancouver wrote about the Northwest, he was here in May, or what some of the Spanish wrote when they were here, also in the summer or spring months, they didn't really experience the kind of weather that Lewis and Clark did. And in 1805, in late November, which in late November, storms are very common, of course, in the Northwest. They were pinned down at a place that's called Dismal Niche. There's a rest stop there that was renamed Dismal Niche back for the Lewis and Clark bicentennial 15 years ago. And they were the first to actually write about Northwest weather that I've been able to find. And what I like about the Lewis and Clark in particular is what terrible spellers they were. One of my other projects, I do the pronouncing for the spelling bee every year, where the winner gets to go to Washington, D.C. and compete against the best spellers in the country. I always thought it'd be fun to have a Lewis and Clark spelling bee, and you could sort of spell things any way you wanted. There'd be no rules. Everybody would win. But they noted in their journals that it rained all day, violent wind from the southeast, violent wind from the south-southeast, throwing the water from the river over our camp, and rain continued all day. The wind increased to a storm from the south-southeast and blew with violence. Oh, how horrible is the day. And actually, we'll talk about the Columbus Day storm chronologically here, but where Lewis and Clark were pinned down for this very intense autumn storm in 1805, it's about 10 miles as the crow flies from where the highest wind speed was recorded during the Columbus Day storm. So they sort of picked a bad place to be at a time of year when windstorms are very common. And of course, there's no photographs of the bad weather, nothing like that. Just the writings of Lewis and Clark. Now, if we skip ahead to 1861, 1862, there are photographs of this very intense winter, which was a combination of rain and snow and intense cold all over the Northwest, from Northern California up into what's now British Columbia. There's no photographs of any part of Oregon. Oregon was already a state by then. And there's no photographs from Washington Territory. The nearest photos I could find are these from Sacramento. And this was a really unusual winter in many ways. And we haven't seen anything like it ever since. Though we just chances are we will see something like it someday, but it's nothing that even approaches the amount of precipitation, the intensity of the cold. It's just completely off the charts. And several people have written about it. One of my favorites is Clarence Bagley, another image of the Sacramento River. Now, there's no images from Seattle of the winter of 1861-62, but there is this photograph of Seattle in 1865. And I have the writings of Clarence Bagley from his History of King County, published back in the early part of the 20th century. This is what Bagley said. The pioneers of that period have always spoken of that season as the Big Winter. The winter of 1861-62 was extremely cold. Snow began falling a little before the holiday season, and when it ceased, the mercury gradually crept down until it reached 4 degrees below zero for 2 or 3 nights. On Lake Union, ice formed 6 inches thick. One day, a party of us crossed through the woods at the Portage, which is over by where Husky Stadium is, and found that Union Bay was also frozen over, but the great body of Lake Washington was free from ice. And this is one of my favorite parts of what Bagley wrote. The ice on Lake Union continued smooth for 6 weeks. Fortunate owners of skates renewed the activities of youth. Thomas Mercer, who had given the name of Union to the lake several years earlier, was then 48 years old. He and George W. Harris, 18 years old, were the champion fancy skaters. It must have been cool to be Thomas Mercer skating, being 48 years old and skating on the lake that you had named. That's a pretty neat thing. My second favorite thing from what Bagley wrote, snow fell 2 feet deep and spoiled the sport. 2 or 3 rough sleds were made and brave attempts at sleighing were made periodically. This is the part. Lacking sleigh bells, small cowbells were used instead. That's that pioneer spirit of making do with what you have, right? Reminds me of something from Laura Ingalls Wilder. We don't have a sleigh bell, but we do have a cowbell. The snow did not disappear until March. And there's some accounts that say that in shady parts of Walla Walla, the snow didn't melt until June of 1861, 1862. So it was a very intense winter. And there's a meteorologist who used to work for King TV, and I think he also worked for Channel 11 back in the 80s and 90s, a guy named Larry Schick. I was an intern at King TV more than 30 years ago, and I got to know Larry back then. He's working on a book about the winter of 1861, 1862. He's done a lot of research, and he's an actual legitimate scientist. And he knew, somehow he saw a reference somewhere to a bunch of data from the 19th century. Before I got deeply into this topic, I always would read about weather stations being set up by the federal government in Portland and in Seattle in the 1890s, maybe the late 1880s. And a lot of the temperature records and precipitation records that we sometimes see being exceeded or close to being exceeded these days. They'll say, it's the hottest it's been in 130 years. But there's actually a lot more data from the 19th century, way more than I had any idea existed. And so what Mr. Schick was able to do, he finally tracked down a copy of this report. It's from the War Department from 1888, and it compiles all this incredible temperature and precipitation information gathered by people mostly at Army camps in what's now Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And each of those Army camps, if they were of a certain size, typically had a member of the camp, a soldier or an officer who was known as the surgeon, who would do the medical stuff, but also was probably the most scientifically trained person there at each camp. And that person would take a morning temperature and an afternoon temperature and record the precipitation. And so there's an incredible amount of data. This is just an example from Fort Walla Walla from 1861-62. Now let me give these comparisons so they're meaningful. So the dry December of 1860, or the regular December, let's say, 2.84 inches of precipitation. And this is probably a combination of snow and rain. Snow melted down, but whatever the total amount, it's melted down to water. So December 1860, 2.84 inches. December of 61, the really terrible winter, 12.84 inches. That's almost 6 times as much precipitation. Incredible, incredible amount. And then the dry January of 61, 4.94 inches. The stormy January of 1862, 11.63 inches, almost 3 times as much. It's over the top. What we also saw during this winter of 61, 62 was intense cold that hung on for weeks and weeks, wiped out much of the livestock industry that was pretty new in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. There was so much snow, the animals couldn't get to the grass to eat, and the farmers, or the people raising livestock, most of whom had been in that area for, at that point, certainly less than 20 years, hadn't seen anything even coming close to this kind of winter, so they weren't prepared with shelter or with other means of feeding the livestock during this intense weather event. And it's the numbers, the stench of the rotting dead livestock outside a place like Walla Walla was notorious in the spring of 1862. So no photographs from that bad winter of 61, 62. We do get to the next big winter of 1880, and we do get a ton of photographs. I have about maybe a dozen or so to share. Most of these are courtesy of Paul Dorpat. I imagine many of you will recognize some of these streets, recognize some of the images. This was a huge storm that fell in the early part. The snow fell in the early part of January 1880. By the time it was all said and done, some parts of town had as much as 7 feet of snow. I like 1880 because it's a real pivotal year for Seattle and for Washington Territory. As I'm sure many of you know, in that point, the population of Seattle was about 3,500 people. It was the second most populous city in the territory. If we were all in person and I could hear you calling out the answer, I would say, anyone want to actually, let's try this. If you can take a guess, or if you know what the most populous city in the territory was in 1880, unmute yourself and just call it out. Anybody?
Walla Walla.
Very good. Not all very few audiences get that on the first guess. I think you guys are probably specially informed, being Washington pioneers. So Walla Walla had something like 3,700. It was just slightly larger than Seattle. You fast forward to 1890, and Seattle has grown to something like 42,000. Walla Walla has grown to 4,700. So this storm hitting in January of 1880 and these glimpses of the city is sort of the last days of sort of the pioneer or the outpost frontier Seattle before things really go nuts in terms of the population growth. So I love these photographs. Commercial Street or First Avenue looking north. Of course, Governor Ferry at the time, the territorial governor, he is well known for having just put his annual report in the mail, extolling the virtues of the mild climate and how we never get snow in Seattle. This has been written about by multiple people, and I always like to imagine him sort of, sealing the envelope and walking out to the mailbox and dropping his report in the mail as the first flakes are coming down. But I don't think that's what really happened. But he talks about the rare occurrence of ice and snow and the almost Mediterranean-like climate here. So it's good old Governor Ferry. Another terrific photograph. Yes, there's Wharf. You see the coal ships in the background there. They're used for taking coal from being harvested over at Newcastle, brought over Lake Washington and narrow gauge rail, and then shipped to California, where the railroad industry was already hungry for this kind of material. And we weren't quite there yet in Washington Territory, so it had a kind of a export market. You see the roofs of buildings collapsed there on the left-hand side. I also like in the lower right-hand corner of the photograph, the water in Elliott Bay isn't quite frozen over, but it's chilly enough where patches of snow are just floating. And as most of you are historians, you understand how exciting it is when you see something referenced in two different places as a way of proving that something is likely true. And so Bagley, just read a little excerpt from what Clarence Bagley wrote about the big snow of 1880. 2-horse sleds made their appearance on the streets to the great glee of all. In Elliott Bay, the snow did not melt as fast as it fell, but accumulated in patches over which the gulls walked. So there's that sort of confirmation of two different sources. It continued to snow all day the 7th, and by night it lay 4 feet deep. And I like what he says here. It's almost like the understatement of the decade. Everybody was surprised at the phenomenon. It was claimed that if there had been no thawing, no settling, or no packing, the depth of the snow by the night of the 8th of January would have been 6 feet. As it was, 4 feet was the average over the city. And then Bagley says something that I think at least one person has thought, if not said, during every single snowstorm ever since in Seattle. After the first surprise and delight was over, people wanted it to go as quickly as it had come. I mean, I feel like that's kind of the standard routine here. You get the excitement of the snow coming down. It's all fun and pretty. Then you see people having a hard time driving around, and then pretty soon they're all sick of it. More snow fell on the 11th, but then came a steady rain that rapidly melted it. Several cattle were lost on the Duwamish by the sheds falling in on them. By the 16th of January, the snow nearly all disappeared. All schools reopened on the 19th. And that's the main reason I loved snow when I was a kid, because they would cancel school. And even to this day, if I'm laying awake early in the morning and they're reading off the names of the school districts that are closed for the day, and I hear Lake Washington School District, where I went, I kind of let out a cheer, even though it has no bearing on me whatsoever anymore. Some other great photographs here. Looking up the hill at First and Cherry. And Paul Dorpat says that with this storm, in January 1880, most of the people who lived in Seattle had moved here from someplace else. A lot of those from the Midwest or parts of the country where snow was pretty common. They hadn't necessarily seen this kind of quantity in Seattle yet. And within, a few hours of the realization that the snow had come and wasn't going anywhere in a hurry, people just gave up and enjoyed it. There was no place to go. It wasn't as if people traveled by roads that much anyway in 1880. And there really was a sense of, building snowmen and sledding and running around that they hadn't really seen in that sort of modern for 1880 Seattle up to that date. Another great photograph. There's down on the Front Street looking north. Now, when I was searching for images of that winter of 1861, 1862, a friend of mine at the Oregon Historical Society came up with this image and another one that follows that are from the same series. She initially thought these might have been from 1861, 62, but I think since she's figured out that these are probably from the big snow of 1880. Can anybody, if you want to take a guess at what we're looking at, unmute yourself and call out what you think we're looking at there. Anybody?
Columbia River.
Very good. Columbia River is correct. As far as we know, it's correct. And you kind of see over on the right-hand side there, there's a person in the lower right-hand corner. There are steamboats that are frozen there at the pier there on the left-hand side. And what I think the photographer is standing on a bridge, not too far from the bank. And for the next image, he or she turns to the right, and we get this image here, where you see part of the bridge there on the right-hand side, then what looked to be, at least 100 people out skating around on the Columbia. And back in the good old days, I guess it's still okay to say good old days, before the Columbia was, modified pretty intensely by hydroelectric dams and other efforts to sort of tame the river, it would freeze over on occasion. Not every year, certainly, but at least once every decade or so, the Columbia would get a pretty hard freeze, even down in the lower reaches, down around Astoria, which is where they believe these images are from. And you can see it was just, nobody was going anywhere. The water wasn't really moving. People are just out ice skating and enjoying themselves. I'd love to know more about these pictures, but there's very little data on them at the Oregon Historical Society collection. There's another picture of St. Helens, Oregon, nearby. Just a little standard western town with a fair amount of snow on the ground. Probably also from that January of 1880 storm. That's the thing. Anytime there's a big weather event in Seattle, chances are it also hit Portland. Chances are it also hit Victoria, BC. If the weather's it's not always exactly the same amount of intensity, and windstorms in particular can really vary in terms of which areas get hit the hardest. But chances are, if a big storm did hit some part of the Northwest, it did something to pretty much every part of the Northwest. And so for our next storm, which we jump ahead about 36 years, we jump to the age of motion pictures. Now, this footage I have here, I only found this very recently. This is from the Royal British Columbia Museum, and it's a short piece of silent footage of the blizzard of 1916, which hit all of the Northwest. And I just love this. This is like the neatest piece of silent film that I've seen in a really long time, just for the atmosphere that it evokes. There's no sound, of course, but it's so easy to get a better sense of the scale of this 1916 blizzard than still footage would, or still photo would. I mean, and these are so easy to identify with. I mean, who hasn't had their car stuck and had to have somebody come and pull you out with a chain? Your brother-in-law or somebody. Those guys are kind of mugging for the camera there. There's a wide shot here coming up where you'll see the sled going by in the lower right-hand corner, right there. Almost looks like something out of that Orson Welles movie, The Magnificent Ambersons, if you're familiar with that film. I mentioned I get to give this talk all over the state, and we saw that photograph of Governor Ferry a moment ago. I was up in Ferry County last winter, and the people there, I was in a tiny little library in Curlew, Washington, and it was just packed full of people. It was a Friday night. I don't think there's anything else going on in town, and a really intent audience. And they got really excited about the snow shovels in this footage. We played it several times and paused it at different spots. They wanted to sort of figure out if the men there pictured were using, commercially made, assembly line snow shovels, or if they were custom made, like one of a kind homemade snow shovels. It's interesting what excites different people. And we had a great time reviewing the footage. I don't know can't remember what we decided exactly, but we spent a lot of time looking at the shovels and thinking about it. So now the blizzard of 1916, talk about Seattle in 1880 and Seattle in 1890. Seattle of 1916, it's a full-fledged metropolis. It looks very much, if you were plopped down in Seattle of 1916, of course, a lot of the buildings would be very different, but the layout of the city, the look of the waterfront, the look and feel of the urban center of town, you'd know you were in Seattle, even if you somehow could get over the fact that you time traveled. Now, this storm hit in late January to early February. Somewhere around 52 to 84 inches fell in the Cascades. Down here in the lowlands, it was closer to 38 inches, which is more than 3 feet. Again, a crazy amount of snow. I don't think I've seen anything even close to that in my lifetime, certainly. But it was also preceded by several days of bitter cold. I love this image of 2nd Avenue. You can see Walla and Nordstrom shoes over there on the left, the Clemmer Theater. I'm not sure why someone has a team of sled dogs, but they do have a team of sled dogs there over on the right. It seems like big snowstorms do sort of bring that out in people. They have one of toys like sleds and sled dog gear they can only use maybe once every decade or so, but sure enough, as soon as the snow falls enough, they bring it out to enjoy it. So these images from 1916 are just, we range all over the place. Up in Everett, this is over on Colby. And what I like about this is, this is proof that the convergence zone, if you listen to modern forecasts, especially last week with some of the rainfall that we got, the way the winds are split around the Olympics and they converge somewhere around South Snohomish County, you often end up getting far more precipitation in Everett than you do in Seattle. I don't have a snow total for Everett. I'm not been able to track that down, but just from these few images from Everett and from some other parts of Snohomish County that we'll look at in a second, it seems like they got way more snow up there than we did down here in Seattle in this big blizzard of 1916. And again, somebody has a sled that they pull out of somewhere, probably haven't used for a decade. They've got it on the streets of Everett in 1916. Same thing in Marysville. 40 inches they claim in Marysville in this image. Marysville High School. Back in downtown Marysville, same kind of deal. And this is also Marysville. I don't know where exactly, but I just like how weird the snow people look. I don't know how you're able to make a snowman that has legs or a neck that's skinnier than its head. This kind of technology has been lost to time. I've shown this to a few people and they think maybe there was straw was used in the necks of the snow people or rebar or something, but something that's very odd about those snow people. Out in the Snohomish Valley, out in Monroe, also looks like another severe, much higher amount than they got down here in King County. This picture of Anacortes up in Skagit, one of my favorite pictures. Lived here all my life, of course, and been around the state a lot the last several years, giving talks for Humanities Washington. I think downtown Anacortes, this is Commercial Street, the last north part of downtown, the last 3 or 4 blocks. I think it's the most unchanged town in Western Washington. The businesses are all different, but the buildings are all pretty much the same, and the look and feel of Commercial Street on Anacortes is just, it's amazing how little it has changed. It's a great place to visit. Another great shot from up in Bellingham in Whatcom County. That's the courthouse in the background there. That's now the Whatcom Museum of Art. And that's a streetcar that's just stuck in the snow because those are relatively light piece of equipment, mostly made out of wood. And the streetcar tracks would fill in with snow and ice, particularly when the cold was very intense and the streetcars were useless. So you see it's just abandoned. There's icicles hanging off the front of it. Up in Roslyn, a rotary snowplow working its way through the main line up in the heavy amount of snow they had in the Cascades for this storm. Beautiful picture from the next day. Nice contrasting light on the, almost like got to be sunlight on the snow. It looks like it's cleared up. It's a beautiful shot. Some images from Tacoma as well, with sort of snarky comments originally published in 1916, where it shows people walking and it says pedestrianizing. And people doing what we talked about a moment ago in Bellingham, where the streetcar tracks are stuck and they're trying to pick the ice out of the tracks. And I love this shot of the Tacoma Junk Company wagon full of tires that didn't survive the frosty weather. And ice skating on Green Lake. If that picture of the Columbia River had 100 people, there's got to be thousands of people on this picture. And Green Lake hasn't frozen over like this since 1950. It used to happen every I don't know, maybe I haven't been able to find an exact number of times that Green Lake has frozen over, but it certainly hasn't frozen over like this for more than 70 years, and this was back in 1916. Here's where you can insert your own joke about Seattle drivers. You know, never quite figuring out how to drive in the snow, even then. And some cool lantern slide of the old Coliseum Theater down what's now the Banana Republic. Had only recently opened few months prior to this, Seattle's original movie palace. And there's some other great shots of this at night. I mean, I used to go to movies at this theater back up until the early 90s, I think, or maybe the late 80s. I don't ever recall the Coliseum letters being lit up like that. I think that's pretty cool. And you see that those same streetcars we saw earlier are still parked over there, frozen there in the snow. This is our First Avenue, Pike Place Market's over on the right. You know, the streets after a snowstorm in the old days, 100 years ago, when there were still a fair number of horses on the streets, that mixture of muck and mud out there was far worse than nowadays, where it's just sort of oil and salt and whatever else gets mixed into the melting, messed up streets. In 1917, there was one horse for every car in Seattle. By 1920, there was one horse for every 123 cars. But the city, the fire department, was still using horses as late as 1924, and several private vendors were still using horse and wagon to deliver in downtown Seattle. So the streets got to be a pretty mucky mess. You recalls Bagley saying, people wanted to go as quickly as it had come. But this next shot, probably the coolest picture of any weather event ever in Seattle history, as far as I can tell. It's that same spot we looked at earlier, 2nd Avenue, where that sled dog team was. Nordstrom Mall and Shoes is over on the left, Clemmer Theater, Hotel Savoy. I remember the Hotel Savoy, I worked in downtown Seattle in the early 80s. The entryway with the mosaic tile that said Hotel Savoy was still in the sidewalk. I'm not sure what year it was torn down, but the photographer here obviously knew what they were doing to take a timed exposure. I think there's a vehicle working its way northbound up 2nd Avenue there on the far left. I see two headlights there, kind of just below where it says Hotel Savoy. But the lighting here is just over the top. And I imagine it probably had some help maybe in the darkroom from the photographer. But what a fabulous picture. It makes you think of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, running up the street, wishing every business a Merry Christmas. Here's that shot we first looked at, right, in the daytime. No substitute for the nighttime shot of that picture from 1916. Now, it wasn't all fun and games in the storm, of course, and the St. James Cathedral there with its dome, which it no longer has because of the storm. There's what it looked like when it opened in 1907. And apparently that dome created a lot of havoc with the acoustics inside the cathedral, so much so they actually put a glass ceiling underneath it and to try to improve the acoustics of speaking and singing in the main part of St. James Cathedral there on First Hill. And so when the snow fell in early February 1916, here's another image looking from the south at the dome. You see there's a parapet there on either side around the dome. The theory is that snow built up in that space between the parapet and the dome itself, the vertical walls of the dome, and pushed in and collapsed it. And so here's an image where the dome is gone. Fortunately, it happened in the afternoon. There was nobody in the building. It happened around 10 to 4 on February 2nd. And several windows were blown out, but only clear glass windows. None of the stained glass was damaged. There was a fair amount of damage within the actual cathedral itself, mainly from melting snow. But they were able to rebuild. This is the famous shot for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. You see the person there in the center right. And you can see just below where the person's standing, those vertical walls that appear to be almost intact. And I haven't been able to find any decent forensic engineering reports or any sort of investigation as to what the actual reasons were. But that's the theory, was that those sidewalls collapsed. Okay, so we skipped quite a bit ahead here from 1916 to 1962 and the big granddaddy of them all, the Columbus Day storm. We just had the 58th anniversary of this on Monday. And then we had a big windstorm the day after, on the 13th of October this year. So it's no surprise that the biggest windstorm in the Northwest came in October. It's typically a season, it's the change between Summer has just ended, autumn's underway, we're not quite winter yet, all that unstable water and in the atmosphere and changing temperatures out in the Pacific. And where the Columbus Day storm was, the remnants of a typhoon in the Western Pacific, Typhoon Frida. You hear some people describe this as Typhoon Frida hitting the Northwest, but this was not a typhoon. But the remnants of the typhoon led to the creation of a very deep, low pressure cell. And again, I'm not a scientist and I don't want to get into too much detail, but the lower the pressure is, the more chance there is for havoc, for air currents to rise quickly and to create unstable air. And that's what low pressure will do. And it created this system. The night before, there was a big storm in Northern California on the 11th, rained out the World Series at Candlestick Park. And then early on the morning of October 12th, the first sign that anything was going on out in the Pacific, in those days, and they still do this to a certain extent today, ships out at sea were radioing in their regular weather reports, and they were all reporting high wind speeds and low barometric pressure. Kinds of reports that if only one ship had reported it, it would have been considered anomalous. But because so many ships were reporting very similar intense numbers for low pressure and high winds, that the Weather Bureau scientists figured something was up. Still, though, they issued a pretty conservative forecast for high winds in the Portland area on Friday afternoon. But there was a meteorologist named Jack Capel who worked for KGW Radio and TV in Portland, one of the stations owned by the Bullitt family, same people who owned King TV in those days. And Jack Capel was on the air and was able to tell people, essentially, run for your lives. And the one big clue that Capel had, he was looking at weather stations in the Willamette Valley on Friday afternoon. And he noticed that, almost one by one, from south to north, those stations were going offline. Like there'd be no report from this station, and then an hour later, no report from that station to the north because the power was going out, or in some cases, the wind speed was so high it broke the wind recording instruments. So this is a recording from KGW Radio from the night of the storm, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to hear the audio. I'm going to play a little bit of the audio, and then I want somebody to tell me if they can hear it or not. Let's see. Can you hear the audio?
No.
You can't hear the audio. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to put my microphone by my computer, and hopefully hear it that way. Let's try it this way. Let's see.
Mobile news wagon, and the signal may not be what you come to expect
from
KGW, but it's about the best we can do under the circumstances. By now.
Whoops, did that work?
It does. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll go back to the audio now. My apologies for the technical difficulties. Here we go.
We're operating at this moment on emergency power being supplied by our mobile news wagon. The signal may not be what you come to expect from KGW, but it's about the best we can do under the circumstances. By now that strong winds have hit the Portland area. We've recorded gusts up to 85 miles per hour, and then there's another one over 80. KGW meteorologist Jack Capel is returning to the KGW studios from the Weather Bureau station at Portland International Airport. There goes another gust over 85 miles per hour. As I was saying, Jack Capel should return momentarily. The entire KGW staff is attempting to gather as much information as we can. Of course, telephone lines are jammed and we're having trouble getting through to many officials. Here's Frank Bonema. Frank, what have you been able to learn?
We've been up in the front of the building with many of the employees here of KGW Radio and TV West looking outside. The wind is howling down 13th Avenue. Across the street, one house has begun to lose a roof. Twigs are going down the street. We also have a hot wire that has fallen across a tree in front of a residence across from the KGW building. It looks like a bad one. Now we've just been informed that KGW TV, Channel 8's tower has gone down. That report from Andy Jordan just moments ago that the TV tower at Channel 8 has fallen.
So you were able to nod your head if you're able to hear the audio. I can see some of you on video. Okay, very good. All right.
It's great.
Okay, good. And so, yeah, that's the photograph there on the lower right is the TV tower at KGW knocked down by the storm. They were off the air for several weeks. The radio station stayed on by using the generating power of the station wagons, running it through the window, a cable up into the window to be able to stay on the air. And radio, I mean, that was an exciting night for the broadcasters. And Same way my father was going out to the garage to tune in local stations here to know what was going on. People in Portland, where the radio was a lifeline in those days, before the internet, of course. Now, low pressure is always the villain in these storms, and this map shows a low pressure cell. Essentially, you know, it's the valleys and the openings in the mountains and things like that, where the high pressure always wants to get to where the low pressure is to equalize. And so the lower the pressure and the more variety in the shapes of the valleys and the mountains and things, the more bizarre and intense kinds of weather systems you'll get. You'll see that happen when a low crosses in front of the mouth of the Columbia. You see it when it crosses over the Strait of Juan de Fuca or over the north part of Puget Sound. It just drains all the air out like a bathtub, and all the different topography in between mixes things up. So the duration of the winds typically isn't a super long time. It's maybe 90 minutes, maybe a couple hours, but it can be very intense for very short periods of time. In the Columbus Day storm, I mentioned that top wind speed was at the Nacelle Ridge radar facility, an old Cold War Air Force radar facility, about 10 miles from Dismal Niche down there where Lewis and Clark were. The wind speed, the gust there was 160 miles per hour. Gusts of 113 at Bellingham, 83 out at the West Point facility at Magnolia in Seattle, 100 miles per hour down in Renton. And a total of 46 people died from Northern California up into southern BC. So it was a deadly storm. There's no overstating that. And the number of trees, the amount of board feet of timber blown down was 3 times what Mount St. Helens knocked down in 1980. So it was a pretty intense blow to the timber industry. These are some pictures from around the area. You know, lots of sad stories about sort of famous trees. And when I say famous, I mean, you know, trees that people in certain neighborhoods loved. Or one of the trees down at Fort Vancouver, one of the apple trees, was knocked down by this storm. So you see lots of beautiful old trees just, you know, reduced to rubble. And city streets in Everett blocked by fallen trees. Down at the governor's mansion, some of the big firs came down. This is not far from where you guys are. I think this is probably a block from the Washington Pioneers headquarters, I believe. It's part of the 520 bridge. 520 was under construction then. It wouldn't open until August of '63. But a piece on a barge broke loose and ran aground there right at Madison Park. And I love this shot, sort of the traditional upturning of the float planes on Lake Union with the gasworks for Gasworks Park still in the background on the right, and Aurora Bridge in the far left. A house in North Seattle that not only did a tree fall on it, but it shorted out the wires and, you know, caught on fire. And some images from Tacoma, big trees falling on beautiful 1950s classic cars. Many trees at Wright Park, which was famous for its diverse assortment of trees, knocked down by the storm. One of the grandstands at the football stadium at PLU, Pacific Lutheran University. You know, the storm hit on a Friday night in October, and Fridays in October mean high school football. And I've heard this story so many times, I now believe it's actually true. Several football games, the place kicker would be out practicing to kick before the game because it hit the Puget Sound area around 7 o'clock, 7:30. The place kicker would kick the ball, and instead of gaining yardage, the ball would go up and behind his head 10 or 20 yards. And I've heard that story from enough people, I actually believe it's true. Several football games were canceled midway through or canceled before they even started because the wind was so intense and the timing was so bad for that. And they didn't want kids stuck on the road trying to make their way home during the storm. You know, different building codes in those days that, you know, ideally, well, if we saw a storm similar to this, we wouldn't see the same kind of damage with just stuff like roof materials being ripped off because, you know, building codes have increased to the point where additional fasteners are required to prepare for something like this. And you have these weird combinations where, you know, trees fall and make a car go one way and the roots pop up and make another car go the opposite direction, almost like a bizarre art project. Of course, it was the second to the last weekend of the Seattle World's Fair, and the campus got shut down early because of the wind. Space Needle got shut down. Space Needle was never in any danger, but the elevators were bouncing back and forth from the elevator shaft, and that made for a scary night for some people. And so they sent most of the people down the staircase, the emergency exit staircase in the central core of the Space Needle. I love this picture from Longview. I just came across this picture recently. course, some clever person has put Gone with the Wind on the marquee, though I think the film that actually was showing there was a John Wayne movie. I talked to a woman the other day who actually tried to go to the drive-in the night of the Columbus Day storm and had to go back home because it just wasn't going to work. Huge part of pop culture phenomenon, and you couldn't look at pictures on the internet in those days, so the quickest way to do that was to publish these sort of cheap little paperback photo sort of collections. You could pick these up at drugstores. One was $1, one was $2.50, and these were produced within a few weeks of the storm. I've looked at them pretty closely. Most of the pictures are from the Willamette Valley, which is where the storm did the most damage. Certainly far more there than in the western Washington area. And there's a couple of economic theories from the Columbus Day storm. One is that all that timber that it blew down created so much excess timber, the mills couldn't handle it all. And that's when they first started shipping raw timber overseas for production for the first time, which led ultimately to damaging the timber industry here in the 70s and 80s. There's also a theory, a guy named John Dodge wrote a book a couple of years ago, and a journalist from Olympia, and he said that so many orchards in the Willamette Valley were knocked out. These are like filberts and plum orchards, and the orchardists just literally knocked out of business. They created hundreds of acres of land just sitting there fallow. And so in the late 1960s, when a group of scientists from Oregon State University wanted to launch a wine industry in Oregon, they found all this cheap land available that had once been nut and fruit orchards in the Willamette Valley that converted nicely to for growing grapes. And so you had this perfect sort of synergy between cheap available land that had been out of whack for a decade and these aviarists, aviarists were able, and viticulturists were able to kind of swoop in and pick up this land and to create the wine industry there. On the timber side, I talked to that guy in Aberdeen when I gave that talk who said that all these Jippo loggers, these independent guys who just go wherever the timber is, they don't work for any one company. He said those guys back in the 50s all had these beat up old trucks held together with baling wire and chewing gum, as the saying goes. There was so much work and so much timber to work on after the Columbus Day storm. Even the Jippo loggers all had new trucks. It was sort of this rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. Or maybe that it's an ill wind that does nobody any good. All right, so it's a few minutes after 2. There's much more we could talk about of more recent storms, but I'd love to hear if anybody has any particular memories of the Columbus Day storm they'd like to share. Somebody want to just unmute yourself and chime in?
Yeah, this is Bob Garish. I was not up here for the Columbus Day storm. My family had moved down to southwestern Oregon to Coos Bay during that storm, and my dad was working for Bonneville Power. He was at work that day. They were going out to clean up the mess from the storm on the 11th at Cape Blanco. And they got caught in the midst of the storm. They had trees blow down around them and had to finally cut trees for the last mile to get into Cape Blanco. And the Coast Guard was just getting ready to abandon the station at that point. But he informed them that they had no power at Port Orford, which is where they were headed to. So they hunkered down and sheltered in the station. The highest wind speed that was recorded was at Cape Blanco. It was 171 miles an hour. And then the anemometer broke with the next gust. So we don't know what the highest wind speed really was.
That's always a bad sign when the wind instruments just kind of split into a million pieces because the wind's blowing so fast. That's crazy. Wow, that's a great story. Who else wants to share a memory from the Columbus Day storm or some other storm if you like?
This is Alan Murray. My father, when he came home from work that day, had heard the announcements about the storm coming, and he was concerned because our daylight basement home faced Puget Sound, Eld Inlet, and he was concerned that our big 7-foot square plate glass windows were vulnerable from the branches that might come off the big fir trees. And, the power went off fairly quickly, as you've previously described. And we did have a wood fireplace that we hunkered down around. And, that was only, almost inches from the big plate glass windows. but we made it through the night. What was interesting the next day is the 7 trees we had to get out of our 7/10 mile driveway. But then we got to the county road, and about a mile down the road, there was a half-mile section where the trees had fallen across the road like matchsticks. But when we got there, there was a tunnel through the trees, but there were many trees that were still 10 to 15 feet or more above the roadway along this road section. Now, this was Saturday about noon or maybe 1 o'clock. By Sunday afternoon, all the firewood gatherers had cleaned up that section of road, and all the wood was gone. But the parcel that all those trees came from laid in that state and I remember crawling across those trees. You could wander all over that property without touching the ground.
Wow.
Eventually, they finally harvested that material for lumber. But that's my memory.
Great story. Who's next?
Our power down our road, we were out of power for 7 days.
Wow. Simpler times. Who's next?
I have a quick story. From Eastern Washington. My name is Stacy Kalko. I'm a historian at Spokane Community College. I live in Spokane. And I was here for Ice Storm 96. So we got almost just under, I think, 2 inches of freezing rain in an extremely short amount of time. We were in the military at the time, and my family and I drove from base housing, which is west of Spokane, for those of you that don't make it over here very often. We drove because everything was out at the base housing, everything in Airway Heights. We get into Spokane, and you could see, as you're driving down the interstate, you could see the spots of black all over as we were driving in. So we got onto Sprague, one of our main thoroughfares. We drove out until the electricity was obviously off for the rest of the valley. That's East Spokane. And then we drove back about 9 blocks to find a restaurant because we were so hungry and we weren't prepared for it. We went in, we ate dinner, it was packed. By the time we got out, the block next to us was black. So in the short amount of time that it took us to get our food, because it didn't take that long, we had 9 blocks of blackout move in. And it was just, we were out, even out in our base housing, we were out for 11 days, I think. That was pretty rough.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, I've read about that storm. That's a pretty intense event. And I think the Spokesman Review published sort of a pictorial book about that I have somewhere in my collection. It's got some pretty crazy photographs of that as well. Yeah. Who's next? I mean, hopefully, this thesis here and hearing those stories, it's always about sort of survival. And of course, we don't hear the stories about the people who don't survive. It sort of kind of limits things, and it's sort of self-selecting. But hearing those stories and hearing what people overcome, I think that makes us stronger families and makes us stronger members of our community. It's sort of, I don't know, gives us a chance to show the best of our humanity, to help our neighbors with something if their power's out and they need something and your power's not, or whatever. So hopefully I mean, beyond just the dramatic appeal of seeing a tree fall down, or watching the power go out, or lightning flashing in the sky, or thunder rumbling, I do think the storms, the big snow, the windstorms, the power failures give us a chance to sort of reconnect with some part of life that, surrounded by technology, and our lives sort of, in some cases, overscheduled or over-digitized. It's a reminder of these really deep elements of humanity that I think are good to stay in touch with. So, I could do this all afternoon, but I know this is just part of an hour program. So I appreciate your patience and with our technical issues we had there. But thanks for sharing your memories. Or anybody else who has any other stories or observations they'd love to share, I'd love to hear 1 or 2 more memories if there's anyone. All right. Well, thanks, Washington.
Well, Felix.
Felix,
I was going to mention, this is Steve Ellersick. My mom's on the line too. What I remember growing up over in Eastern Washington, Northeastern Washington, and on Pend Oreille County was the 1968 winter, where the snow was so deep we could just walk on right on to our roofs. The snow was so deep.
Wow.
I remember my dad and neighbors, shoveling snow, and it was over I was small then, but it was still way over my head.
That's great. That was right around Christmas time, or was it early January? I'm trying to remember when that was.
Yeah, good question. I don't know if my mom remembers.
I think it was just after Christmas, if I'm remembering what I've read about it correctly. So anyway, well, stay safe in the big storm. Stay safe in the pandemic. I'd love to hopefully meet you all in person sometime. And thanks to Washington Pioneers for hosting me today. And I'm going to be joining. I've never joined the organization before, but the membership pitch at the beginning convinced me that I need to join this organization. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you.